All right, hello everyone. So, I'm Brian. I started a company 15 years ago, a software company. That's my background. And unlike a lot of other entrepreneurs, I really didn't have the passion for my company's products or services. Sounds like a bad recipe for an entrepreneur, right? I was passionate about the way we ran the company. What drove me to start a company in the first place was that I was dissatisfied. I worked in other organizations, and they had all left me feeling like there's got to be a better way. I constantly ran into obstacles. The bureaucracy, the politics, it just left me hungry for a better way to work. And what was particularly disturbing, in my prior career, I was in aerospace software, and I worked at a really cool mid-sized company that won an award for being the best mid-sized company to work for in America. And I hated working there. Thought I'm in trouble. I really don't like working at the best company to work for in the country. And you know, it was a great company by all the conventional measures. The culture was great, the benefits, the pay, the people were great. But something about the fundamental system itself left me feeling like there's just got to be a better way. I felt like I couldn't use my talents. They were constantly stuck or blocked. Right? I have visions, and I go to a boss, and my boss didn't quite see it the same way. Or my boss was on board, but the number of stakeholders I had to get bought in before I could actually drive a significant change effectively killed the initiative. The politics of it, there was so many obstacles to driving change. So I dropped out, I started my own company, and I resolved to use my company as a laboratory. And for the next many years, I went out and just experimented. Tried every process, technique, approach, anything I could find that might be part of building another way of organizing. And I eventually came up with something that's now called Holacracy and is spreading. So let me tell a story about something that was kind of an inspiration for me along this journey. I'm a private pilot. I have a pilot license, and when I was still a student pilot about 15 years ago, I had my first solo flight with no instructor where I was flying away from my home airport, hundreds of miles away. So long trip. And I had never done this before without an instructor. I had 20 hours of flight time under my belt. They actually let you get up in a plane alone and fly hundreds of miles away with 20 hours of training. It's rather remarkable. And I'm on the journey, and the low voltage light comes on my instrument panel. And I don't quite know much about what that means. They don't teach you much about the plane's hardware, right? I barely knew how to keep the thing level. And the low voltage light is glaring at me. So I follow my instinct. That was a terrible idea in hindsight, but my instinct was to check all of the other instruments on my control panel. Right, so one by one, I looked at each of them. My altimeter said, you're not losing altitude, so really there's not a problem here. My airspeed indicator said, you're not losing speed, so everything's fine. My navigation aid said, I'm perfectly on course, nothing to worry about. Every other instrument said, everything's fine, nothing to worry about, except for the low voltage light. So I effectively let the other instruments outvote the low voltage light. Right? I said, it must not be that big of a problem. Only one instrument is reporting anything anomalous. Right? It can't be that bad. So I just ignored it, and I kept flying. It turns out that was a really, really terrible decision. I nearly crashed the plane. I ended up completely lost in a storm with no power, no navigation, no radio, violating international airspace, and nearly ran out of fuel. I did make it down, barely, and at the end of this rather traumatic experience, you reflect after these things. And I was thinking about this and realized this all started when I let all of the other instruments outvote that low voltage light, and that's exactly what I'm doing in my software company. Often, there's one person who works for me that sees something that no one else does, that senses something that's off. And everyone else says, yeah, I just don't see it. No, I think we're fine. How many times in your organizations have you been the low voltage light? Right? The one that sensed something that could be better or could cause harm if we ignore it and get outvoted or just find it hard to drive change. And I realized now I had become, as CEO, the bottleneck in my organization That's exactly what I didn't want to create. That's why I dropped out of other organizations to start my own. It was to make sure anyone who sensed anything, anywhere in that company, could use that to drive positive change. That's what I wanted. And I realized something was in the way, even when that was my primary goal here. And that thing in the way, I thought was me. And it was. But the more I explored this, the more I realized it wasn't just me. It was the structure underneath my organization, the management hierarchy. This is the way we've been organizing for about a century in its modern form, the management hierarchy. And it worked. It worked great. This has been a phenomenally successful approach to structuring companies. It's got us to where we are today. We're not sitting here talking about new ways to organize because this has failed us miserably for 100 years. We're here because this has created so much success in the world that it's created new levels of complexity and challenge that we're struggling to resolve in our management hierarchies today. And this, to me, is where my exploration got me really looking. I realized this is a way of dividing out power, and it was a completely unconscious one for me. When I started my business, I didn't sit down with my co-founders and say, how should we structure power in our company? Right? Do we want to vest all power with a CEO and then break it down a hierarchy of managers? Right? Or do we want to use a different way? I don't know many entrepreneurs that actually consciously ask that question. I sure didn't. I just took it as a given. I assumed this was the only way to structure and govern power, to scale a company. We need some way to get accountability and alignment and results. I mean, I'm enough of a CEO to know that you can't just throw out structure, right? You got to have these things. But what I didn't ask was, is there another way to get those benefits? Is there another way to get alignment? Is there another way to get accountability, to give people career paths, all the things we use the management hierarchy for? Is there another approach that maybe doesn't have some of the downsides, that leaves anyone free in the organization to drive change so we don't outvote the low voltage lights? And that question became a focus for me over years of experimentation. How can we build a system that doesn't have the bottlenecks in it that we have in this structure? Even as CEO at the top of a management hierarchy, I often felt like I couldn't even drive change effectively. Right? And if the CEO at the top of the hierarchy feels limited and stuck by the structure, how do you think everyone else feels? Right? It's really hard to drive change in these systems. They resist it. And now, that was fine. Mid-last century. Right? If you were an executive in 1950, think of the complexity you faced in your world. Think of the speed you had to respond with to keep your business healthy. Think of the number of inputs you had to manage and deal with. What do you think? A typical day in 1950, you're an executive. How many messages do you have to deal with in a day? What do you think? Somebody shout something out. 5, I heard. 10, I don't know, somewhere in that ballpark, sure. Today, typical executive, through all channels, emails, social media, texts, you name it, right? How many messages do you have to deal with? Hundreds, if not more. It's an order of magnitude or 2 or 3 different, right? It's a hugely different world today. And this structure resists change. It's not responsive to that level of demand. It's responsive when you have 5 to 10 a day you have to deal with. And by the way, it's not just the executives getting all those bombardment of messages today, right? It's throughout the organization. Our systems are so much more complex today. So I looked around. What other systems in the world can we see that have a different way to organize? And you don't have to look far. Look at our cities around us. We see a different paradigm in how we organize at play, and one that's actually working quite well. It's chaotic. Go Paris especially. It's chaotic out there. But there's also order in that chaos. Right? There's this remarkable degree of order here, and there aren't bosses trying to figure it out. I went to a restaurant last night, had a salad. That salad had lettuce in it from some part of the world. I'm not quite sure where, Mexico maybe. Some peppers from Chile. They were, of course, to get the salad there, that meant there was cooperation with growers and pickers and shipping companies and sailors to get that salad over to me. And then not to mention the local market that buys those wholesale, the restaurant owner that buys them, and the chef that cooks them. Massive global act of cooperation to get my salad to me for dinner. And they didn't know I was coming. They didn't plan this. There wasn't a supply chain management department making sure I got my salad all prepped. I mean, think of the months of planning, right? If we were going to organize that top down in a typical company, right? That's a huge project. And yet, it doesn't happen. We have this other way of getting order. It's a self-organizing system. It's an emergent order. We have different actors in a city, modern economy, right? Everyone has their own independence and autonomy. They respond and adapt to their local environment. They use their judgment. They work with others. They have agreements. They're not totally, this isn't a complete anarchy. There's a framework that gives us order. There's laws. There's rules of exchange of how we collaborate together that allows resources to just kind of flow through this web of order and get to the right place. That allows me to pretty much just fly into any modern city and trust I can find a ride to a meal, to a place to sleep, get any supplies I missed, all of that. Just emergent order there when I need it. This is familiar. This is nothing special. We know this in our societies, right? And we know it works better. We've tried organizing economies in a top-down, predict and control, planned order, and it doesn't work, as well as enabling self-organization, giving people a framework to work within and a lot of freedom to adapt locally within that framework. And yet, in our companies, we still try the other approach. It's like we step back into the feudal empire whenever we walk into the doors of our office. There is a king, there are barons, and there are peasants. Right? And there is an attempt to get control, which we need, through this central planning and top-down ordering. And yet, if it can work in our cities, I think perhaps that paradigm can work in our companies. At least that was my initial thought, and now, a decade and a half later, I can tell you it does. There are about 1,000 companies today in the world using this approach to getting order. There are no bosses, there are no management hierarchy in these companies. They have this distributed peer-to-peer control system, much like a city. Or another metaphor, the human body. There are how many trillions, I'm not sure what the number is, trillions and trillions of cells working together in your body, collaborating together within a framework, and yet there's no boss cell that tells the others what to do. There is no CEO cell. Even the organs aren't bossing around the cells within, they're integrating them into a larger function. Each cell has autonomy, has its own input-output and self-organizing process. And yet the organ stitches together these autonomous functioning units into a larger autonomous functioning unit, which is just part of a larger system. And this works. This is nature's way of dealing with complexity at scale. And that's the paradigm that we ultimately baked into the system that now is called Holacracy. It's an alternate system. It's a replacement for the top-down management hierarchy. And it's one that is deeply empowering, that gives people the freedom and the autonomy to self-organize, to adapt locally to their environment. And I'm going to share a bit about it with you. One of the counterintuitive things, though, I want to start with. When I first wanted a more empowering environment where nobody outvoted the low-voltage light, right, I thought, well, let's get rid of all of the things that are in the way in most companies today. Let's get rid of the structure and the policies and the bureaucracy and all that stuff. And I ran into an interesting challenge. When you throw out a lot of that structure, when you throw out a lot of the policies and all that stuff, you don't leave people with a deeply empowering environment. You leave them confused, right? If you go to whoever works for you tomorrow and say, guess what? You're fully empowered. Go use your judgment. Good luck. Right? You think that changes much? Right? Probably not. And worse, if you tell somebody, go use your judgment and do whatever, they know that there's really a limit there, right? They know there's something that they really shouldn't do. And if that's not clear and transparent, they're going to spend a lot of energy and time worrying about where the boundary really is and trying to figure out what it is. So ironically, if you want a deeply empowering environment, you need boundaries, you need structure, you need clarity, you need policies, rules, all the things that today get in the way of empowerment. You need them. You need them to be clear and transparent, You just need different ones than you have in place today. You need lightweight ones. You need ones that can change and adapt to changing circumstances, that aren't constrictions that get in the way of the work, that aren't smothering people, that instead are enabling, that give people clarity. If you don't know where your limit is, you don't know where your power is. And if you don't know what you can't do, you don't know what you have the freedom to do without checking with anyone. If you don't know when you do have to go get permission for something, then you don't know when you don't have to go get permission. So one of the goals of Holacracy is to create clarity around these things. And the kind of clarity that is minimally sufficient, lightweight, agile, and flexible, so it can change at any point. As soon as it gets bureaucratic, change it. Right? Keep it minimally sufficient, lightweight clarity of boundaries. And here's one way Holacracy does that. So Holacracy is a role-based system. It breaks down work into roles. And these roles aren't organized in a management hierarchy like we know them. In fact, one person might fill roles in many parts of the company. So I fill roles in about 5 different teams in my company, and I fill about 20-some roles. Right? So each role isn't a job. It's one bite-sized chunk of work. This is one role I'm doing right now, my spokesperson role. Right? And each role has a purpose. Holacracy is a purpose-driven system. So every role has a purpose, which is a part of a team's purpose, which is a part of the whole company's purpose. And it's all about breaking down purpose. And my role has some accountabilities, which tells others what they can expect of me. So there's clarity here. I know what my job is, and others know they can expect these things of me. This gives a clarity to work with. And the golden rule of Holacracy is this: to serve your role, to get the job done, you have the full authority to make any decision or take any action as long as there's not an explicit rule against it that the team has created in what we call a governance process. I'll come back to that. So unless there's a rule against it, you have the freedom to do it. You do not need to call a meeting and socialize it. Anyone find how hard it is to drive change by socializing decisions sometimes? Right? Calling painful long meetings to talk about them. You don't need to do that. You have the authority to use your judgment. If you want input from someone else, ask their input. If you want to call a meeting because you think it's a good idea, do it. But don't do it to make sure everyone's bought in and comfortable with it. There's a different way to get them comfortable here. Use your judgment. So golden rule, you have the full authority to make any decision unless there's an explicit rule against it. This is the opposite of the implicit culture in most companies I've encountered today. In most companies today, the basic norm is don't do anything you don't already ordinarily do unless you get permission. And you get permission one of 2 ways. Either the boss gives you permission, or ironically, in our autocratic management hierarchies, most decisions don't come from the boss. Mostly, you get permission by calling a big, long meeting or talking to every stakeholder, socializing it, and getting everyone bought in, which is incredibly slow. So this is the opposite. You don't need to do any of those things. You already have permission unless there's a rule against it. And if somebody wants to prevent you doing something, the burden is on them to get an explicit constraint put in place so that you can see, wait, I do need to check with somebody if I do this specific thing. And here's an example of one of those. This is another role in my company, our web architect. This role has a purpose of a clear and sexy website for Holacracy, and my company is Holacracy One. And this role has a domain. Think of that like the role's property. This role owns the website, our website. That tells me, in my spokesperson role, if I want to mess with the website, I need his permission. This is the same way we distribute control in a society, right? I know that I can decorate my kitchen however I want, and I don't need to call a big meeting of the neighbors to make sure they're all, in agreement with how I want to change my kitchen. But I know if I want to take my neighbor's car to the airport, I should probably ask his permission, right? That's his property, my kitchen's mine, we have clear property lines, and because of that, we don't need a baron. And we don't need somebody to arbitrate and break down and tell us what we can do. I know what's mine to control, and I know what my neighbor gets to control. And that's what this is doing here. So we have a distributed control system. Different roles have different property. I know in my spokesperson role, I can do anything that makes sense to me to express my purpose. But if I want to mess with the website, I have to talk to the person filling that role. Status and hierarchy doesn't matter here. There is none. It doesn't matter if he's the newest person to join my company and I'm the founder. Doesn't matter. His role controls the website. If I want to mess with it, I need to make sure I'm not going to cause harm to his property. Short of that, I can do anything that makes sense to me. So that itself is useful, but it's not enough, right? If you want to see what bureaucracy looks like, go try to document all of the roles, accountabilities, and property rights in your company. You'll come up with all these big descriptions, and they'll be out of date and irrelevant by the time you're done. Right? That's what happens with a typical job description. And let's be honest, when was the last time you ran to your job description to get real good clarity about what you should do today? And anyone go check their job description to see what they should do in the past week, month, year? Right? It's very rare because they don't have useful clarity. They're out of date. So if you want to avoid that kind of bureaucratic mess, you need to start with a really simple, lightweight set of roles and restrictions, and you need to let them evolve over time. You need to make sure anyone can change something that's in the way. So you need a process to evolve the rules, the boundaries, the property at play, to add expectations on roles when you discover they're needed, and to remove ones that are no longer useful. And with Holacracy, we do that with a governance process. So every team, we call it a circle, this is our outreach team, marketing basically. And all of these little green and blue circles, those are roles. My spokesperson role is in there. Our web architect role is in there. And once every month or so, anyone filling a role in this team is invited to come to this governance meeting where they can propose changing any policy or any role in that team. Right? So anyone in that team can come and propose any change they need to. And this is where our structure comes from. It doesn't come from somebody designing it and applying it. It comes from the team doing the work, learning together. What do we need to expect from each other? So here's an example. Let me go back a few slides here. This is my spokesperson role. When we first created that role, we didn't have a list of accountabilities. We had a purpose, and that's it. It was an empty role, just one purpose. We created it, gave it to me, and said, go do this, good luck. That's how most roles start. And with time, we started learning. We learned what we need to expect of me so that others can do their job effectively. Right? So for example, this third one, defining criteria for acceptable speaking engagements. Where that came from was one day, I have a colleague in another role on this team called casting agent. My casting agent role is the one that books me for speaking engagements. And she got really frustrated. She was doing all this work, assessing opportunities. She'd negotiate with a potential talk, and then at the end of the process, she'd present it to me, and I'd shoot it down sometimes and say, nope, I don't think so, wrong market, right? Or no, I don't think so, wrong format, wrong audience, whatever. And she felt really disempowered, that sucks. So she went to a governance meeting, and she said, look, to do my role well, to be empowered in my role, I need to expect from you that you are defining criteria for these speaking engagements that you'll accept, because if I had that criteria in advance, I could assess it myself, and you wouldn't shoot it down at the end of the process. I could use my own judgment there, right? So I need to be able to expect that from you. And she proposed in this governance process, adding that expectation of my role. It took about 3 minutes. There's a structured decision-making process. It's not a free-for-all meeting like we're often used to. It's a very structured decision-making process. It took about 3 minutes to get from that proposal to a new expectation of my role. And then afterwards, she turned to me and said, okay, great, so when can I count on you to have that published by? When do you think you're going to get that done by? Right? Now, the interesting thing about this story, I'm the founder of this organization. She was our newest hire right out of college. In what companies do you know where the newest hire right out of college in 3 minutes can propose a new expectation on the founder of the company, right, and get it adopted, and then turn to him and say, so, when are you going to have that done by? Right? I think that's pretty cool. And it let her get her job done and be more empowered. There is no CEO here. There is no manager. There is no subordinate. There's just people filling roles and all sharing the burden of management in this governance process, right? Evolving our rules, evolving our structure. based on real tensions, based on what we're actually encountering that needs to change. We're not over-designing this up front. We're not doing a big exercise of documenting our whole structure. We're sensing the gaps between where we are and some potential improvement, where we could be. Right? We're using the tensions to drive change. And not just one person, the manager on a team, everyone on the team. That governance process is done in every team. Every team is governing itself. It's a self-governing system. Every team is governing its policies that affect that team, the roles they have on that team, and anyone filling a role on that team is invited to participate. But the restriction is they can't come in with just brilliant ideas. They need to come in with grounded tensions. In other words, they need to be able to give an example. Here's something I was trying to do to express my role's purpose or one of my accountabilities. And here's a way I could express it better. It has to be grounded and concrete. And we use that to evolve the design of our team, evolve the structure. And this scales into a totally different kind of structure. This is a screenshot of my company's org chart. And each of these circles is doing a governance meeting, right, regularly, governing all the little green and blue roles within. And then we have these broader circles that are wrapped around, and they govern the intersection between the circles. Right, think of this like little cells within an organ, and then all these organs together work together in an overall system. Right? And every level has autonomy, and every level is self-governing. Right? The broader circle doesn't get to tell the subcircles what to do any more than my cardiovascular system bosses around the heart, or the heart bosses around the heart cells. It's not a command hierarchy. It's a structure that's called a holarchy. It's how nature organizes complexity. It's autonomy integrated into a larger whole functioning unit. That itself is an autonomous whole functioning unit within a larger one. It's different than the way we think of structuring a company, which is as a command hierarchy of who can tell whom what to do. Here, the broader circle doesn't have the command authority to tell the subcircles what to do. What it does is figure out the boundaries between them. What are they accountable for? How does the property line break down between the subcircles? And then it's up to the subcircles to do the same across their roles. And it's up to anyone filling a role to use their judgment and lead. There's no boss to hide behind or anything like that. When it's your role, you have the authority to lead that role. You don't get to defer that authority to anyone else. This can be rather uncomfortable. Ever seen somebody in a management hierarchy that kind of was uncomfortable taking on too much leadership? And it's easy to look to the boss to make the hard decisions. You don't get that benefit in this system. You have to step up and lead your role. That can be tough. And it can be tough for bosses. Just stepping into this system and realizing I no longer have the command authority I'm used to. Right? I have to learn a new way to lead. I have to be the kind of boss now that instead of commanding the action, I create clarity. I create clarity of what roles do we need in this team, where are the boundaries, what are the accountabilities that we need them to figure out how to do. I have to be the kind of leader that creates leaders, not creates followers. So ironically, I think what Holacracy does is get us the exact same kind of leadership that we want anyway in a management hierarchy, right? And the kind of leaders we want to be. I don't know many bosses that aspire to being micromanaging control freaks, right? But when things get hard, it's really easy to slip back into that pattern, because I did all the time. It's simply the easy road. What Holacracy does is remove my ability to take the easy road. I do not have command authority. If I go to somebody filling a role and I say, do this, they're going to look at me and say, yeah, you don't have the authority to tell me what to do, thanks. Right? If you want to expect something from me, you should propose it in governance, and then it's still my autonomy to figure out how to lead it. So by removing that vehicle, all I have left to me is the ability to go do what I probably should do anyway. Create clarity, figure out the right structure and process here to get the results we need. Here's a picture of Zappos. Zappos is 1,600 people doing Holacracy. Every one of those little pixels is a role. There's thousands of them. And every one of those circles, there's about 400 or 500 circles in that picture. Right? And this screenshot, what I love about this, if you looked at their structure today, it looks totally different. It's organic. It's living. It's changing. It's adapting. The circles themselves can come and go and merge and split. right? There's this organic quality of this whole system is just constantly in flow, in flux, it's changing. There's no managers in there. There's self-organization at play. It's like a body. And to make all this work, I like to think of Holacracy sometimes like a game, right? It is very gamified. It's gamifying the way we do business, right? There's these different processes and moves you can make. And to keep a good game fun, it's kind of important to have a rule book. Right? It's not a very fun game. If you go over to a friend's house and they say, we're going to play a board game, and they just make up all the rules as they go, and usually in their favor, right? I feel like that's what management hierarchy is like. I often feel like I'm playing this game where somebody else has all the rules in their head. They're not consistent, right? And they make them up as they go, and usually in their favor. It's very frustrating. But here, the rules are written down. This is called the Holacracy Constitution. It is the rule book for how power works in this organization. So when a company adopts Holacracy, after they've tasted it, usually there's some like little workshop, they get a test case going, they try it. But once they're ready to adopt it, the first move is for the CEO, or sometimes it's a manager within a broader company. There's departments in various large companies that are doing this at a department level. But some leader, CEO or otherwise, who wants to shift the way power works from a command hierarchy to this distributed governance process, they use the rule book to do it. They sign a declaration ceding their power to run that company or that part of the organization however they want into a constitutional process where nobody is above the law. Right? It's like a king signing away their ultimate sovereign power to run the country however they want into a legislative process that says there is now rule of law in the land here, and you can hold me to it. Which is where you'll sometimes see people going to former CEOs that did this, and sometimes reminding that former CEO, you don't actually have the authority to tell me that anymore. So thanks for your advice, I'll consider it. You know? Imagine somebody turning to the former CEO after getting a, quote, order and saying, well, cool, thanks for your input, I appreciate it. I'll let you know what I decide. Right? It's pretty cool. It's actually cool on the other side. As a former CEO, one of the things that I always hated was when people came to me and said, what do you want me to do about something? I don't know. That's why I hired you, right? I want you to figure out what to do about that, right? Don't defer the hard decisions to me. Lead. But now I have this cool defense. I can say, I don't have the authority to tell you what to do anymore. Because I signed this constitution that places that authority into a governance process. And guess what that governance process did? We created your role, and we gave you that authority. So that's yours to lead, not mine. Now, if you want support, I'm happy to offer ideas and advice as long as you clearly retain the burden of leadership. It is yours to lead, not mine. I don't have the authority to tell you what to do. It's a very different way to run an organization. It's in use by about 1,000 companies today, all over the world. It's growing exponentially. That number is on a significant climb. And they're all using this rule book. This is a generic document. That's what makes Holacracy, I think, so unique in the self-management movement. There's a broader movement of organizations heading in this direction. And what Holacracy has done is give a generic system so that anyone that wants to do self-management and shift the way power works can use that rule book and say, here's a framework for how we can self-organize in our company. It doesn't tell you, that rule book does not tell you how to solve your problems and structure your business. It doesn't tell you how to hire people, fire people, pay people. It doesn't tell you how to market services or build your products. Right? All it does is give you a framework for deciding those things. And one that doesn't put the power to define things solely in a boss in a hierarchy, but gives everyone access to a governance process. So you still have to do the hard work of figuring out how to hire, fire, pay, budget, plan, manage, execute, whatever it is you do. This just gives you a framework so that anyone can drive positive change based on what they're actually experiencing is in the way. It allows you to self-govern how your unique organization is going to work. So in summary, key shifts. We're going from static job descriptions to these dynamic roles, small chunks of work. People can fill roles in multiple parts of the company, all distributed throughout. People are free to craft their own unique job by a collection of roles, maybe in different parts of the company, to find their best way to contribute. And instead of authority being delegated down a hierarchy, authority rests in a constitutional process and then is broken out to different roles. So every role has authority, every role leads, and every role follows when other roles are leading in their area. And that means instead of these large-scale reorgs, like every few years in big companies, the big reorg that tries to solve all the tensions and creates more than it solves, right? Instead, we have this iterative process. Every team is doing a micro reorg every governance meeting. They're iterating, they're experimenting, and they're learning the best structure for them. And because we have that governance process, we don't need to get alignment by socializing and playing the politics, by talking to our friend over in accounting to get something moved through a stuck, broken process. We can simply fix the process. We can go to a governance process and we can change anything. And we can get clarity on what we all need to align with to keep this system moving and working fluidly. Very different approach. And with all that said, I'm going to pause there and shift for some questions. So in summary, I call this a new social technology. Right? It's a new way of organizing power. I capture my own personal purpose in the world as I show people a radical new way to organize power. So I hope I've given you at least a glimpse of a pretty radical new way to organize power in a company. So, with that said, thank you. Questions?